Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start with introductions, and then people can continue filing on in, dropping in on the meeting. So good evening. I'm Gabriela Martinez. I'm Director of Education at MOLA, and on behalf of the staff at the Museum of Latin American Art, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's crochet earring workshop with artist Nathalie Sánchez. This workshop is presented by the Dwight Stewart Youth Fund, without whose generosity this program could not have been possible. And MOLA also receives support from the Robert Gumbiner Foundation, the Arts Council of Long Beach, and the City of Long Beach. So if you haven't already, please gather your necessary materials. Nathalie has laid them out, but again, I'll repeat: aluminum crochet hooks, light or medium weight solid color acrylic yarn, scissors, blunt-ended yarn needle or jumbo bit tapestry needle, a set of metal hoop earrings, and a lighter. So tonight's workshop is facilitated by Nathalie Sánchez. Raised and rooted in Los Angeles, Nathalie is an interdisciplinary artist, social justice arts educator, museum worker, and arts advocate. She graduated with her BA in art history and studio arts with an emphasis in education from Loyola Marymount University, and received her M.F.A. in public practice from Otis College of Art and Design. She founded Nati Studio in 2018, and it showcases her fiber-based practice. So you are free to turn on your cameras and chime in with any questions or comments throughout the workshop, or if you feel more comfortable, you can also drop any questions into the chat box. And if Nathalie doesn't catch it, then I will go ahead and pose the question to her. So it's 6:05, so let's go ahead and start with the workshop.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Gabriela. And thank you, Mola. And also an extended thanks to Arturo, who also supported with this workshop. My name again is Nathalie Sánchez. I go by she, her, hers. And it's a pleasure to be with you. It's an honor that you're spending your Friday night with me. And I will definitely tell you from the get-go that I am still learning when it comes to crocheting. I first was taught by a friend many, many years ago, and eventually took it up by more learning on my own. So I'm a little bit more of a self-taught crocheter. And I have to say, if anybody does have any advice or tips for us as we continue on with the workshop, you're welcome to either unmute yourselves and share, or maybe drop it in the chat box. So I invite that. I am going to be presenting and going step by step on how to create your very own, whether it be upcycling your hoop earrings, such as this one here, that you see. That's one example. Or maybe you have some hoop earrings that you're going to be using, that we're going to wrap some yarn around, more or less, but using a very basic crochet stitch. It's along the lines of what's called a chain stitch. Okay, so this is really intended for all skill levels, but just keeping in mind that I'm going to be mindful of our beginners that are here with us today. Okay, now before I do begin, I thought I'd go ahead and share just a little bit more about, about me in terms of crocheting, and then eventually how it became both in terms of my Nati Studio practice, how I started crocheting earrings, just like the ones I have on. So now I was really, really inspired by an exhibition I saw a couple of years ago at the Getty called Golden Kingdoms, which showcased quite the variety of these ancient gold and quite both just gorgeous and ornate earrings, jewelry, and other adornments from many, many years ago from all across the Americas. And so that is actually the inspiration behind my work, both in terms of the vibrancy of the colors used, as well as more or less the shapes as well. Now, I personally love earrings. And so if you do want to also follow me on Instagram, I'll go ahead and share that in a little while too. So I'm happy to share any advice or suggestions when it comes to even supporting other jewelry designers, as well as earring makers. So that's a little bit about me. And what we'll be doing now is me just sharing some examples of my work. And then after that, we'll go ahead and step by step work on crocheting your very own earrings. Okay, so I'm gonna move this aside for just the time being, all our supplies. And share just here I have some examples. And I was able to find one of my first crocheted earrings, which you'll see here, in which I quite literally did exactly what we're doing today. Is I had some existing hoop earrings, which I wrapped with this, this beautiful multicolored yarn. Now that's how I started. As years progressed, I started experimenting, and today I'm making works that look maybe along these lines now. So this is something I just made last week, in fact. So this is how it started. This is how it's going. A few more examples, just to give you an idea of the breadth of my work, is I even experimented trying to really emulate some of the bamboo earrings we've seen before, using different colors and textures, of course, experimenting with overlay. So you'll see here, it's actually two colors, but first it was wrapped with the, oops, sorry about that, this ivory color and then the orange. And then eventually really experimenting with the designs you could make. So you see some patterns here as well. Other items I've made, or I started experimenting with necklaces. So this one inspired by RG, and even more recently, the past year, even with masks. So this is one example of that. And lastly, I thought I'd go ahead and share, I even decided to go a larger scale. And so this is a little purse here. I know it's so large that it's outside the frame with the handle. Now, for the purposes of our workshop today, we're going to be doing something more or less starting along the lines of this one. However, by all means, if you want to expand, experiment, or really, decide that you're going to try something outside the scope of what I'm going to be showing you, please, I encourage you to do that. And not only that, at the end, I'm hoping that we can also share. Okay, so I'll just kind of keep this one local.
So Natalie, we've had a couple of people drop in a little bit after you explained or you showed the tools. Would you mind just sharing those really quickly again?
Oh, of course. In fact, perfect timing actually. So what we're going to be using today is a hoop earring. So if you have one handy, or anything that resembles like a circle, for the most part. I am going to be using my crochet hook here. This is my favorite one. It is a 3 to 3.25 millimeter. If you have either a pair of scissors, I also have, truthfully, anything works. You just have to make sure you're able to cut the yarn. And then towards the end, I have two examples here of our large kind of blunt. You just want to make sure it's not sharp needle. Here are two examples there. And then lastly, I use the lighter. So, and I'll share in a moment why. As a reference point, some of my crocheters might be using different tools, which is fine. Truthfully, it's whatever you're comfortable with. There's, for example, some hooks that have a handle. I personally prefer the aluminum. And I know in the materials list, I had suggested a couple of different yarn types. For the purposes of today, I'm going to use a solid color. And the reason for that is sometimes if you use patterns and if you're still kind of learning or a beginner, it's a little, you can kind of get lost in the patterns in terms of, you know, kind of with regards to the stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and use this, let's see, called the Autumn Red. And so I'm going to be using, I hope this isn't a commercial. So this is actually quite a common yarn brand. And you'll notice on the back of the label that it will indicate what type of hook is recommended. So this one's a 5.5 millimeter. And basically, for those folks that want to know like why these numbers is not only the size of the actual hook, right, the crochet hook, but you want to make sure that, see if you can see this, right, that it kind of is in alignment, right? It's about the same. If it's too small, right, you're going to have really big crochet hoops or stitches. If it's too large, it's going to be too difficult for you to actually use the crochet hook. And just to give you an example of that, remember, hooks come in all different shapes and sizes. So this is just an example of very, very large one, right? So you would definitely maybe use a larger yarn, right? Whereas this one's a little bit more of a medium. And then you'll find more information on the back as well, okay? In terms of the, so this is the weight, so it's a medium. And then of course, based on your tool of choice. So for some folks, they might be knitting. Today we'll stick to crocheting. Okay, great. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? No? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the comments as well. So I'll go ahead and push this aside so we can get going. We'll begin, of course, with the hook, your scissors, and I'm sorry, your hook, earring and scissors. I know this might be a personal preference, but there's you're going to find that the yarn comes out of two ways. So either inside, right? If you haven't already undone the yarn, I know some people have a kind of a ritual of undoing the yarn and kind of wrapping it into a ball. And sometimes even putting it in yarn bowls. Again, it's whatever you're comfortable with. I prefer to get the yarn from the inside and it just pulls out really seamlessly. Otherwise, if you get the yarn from the other side, it will be wrapped over and you would at one point have to take off the label. It gets a little uncomfortable. Great. Now, you kind of notice here that it's already fraying. So that naturally happens. Before we get going, I'll go ahead and just trim it off. But oops. The reason why we have the lighter, I know, gotta love it. The reason we have the lighter is of course, for any young people out there, you have to make sure that we're at a safe distance, adult supervision. So I just light the end a little bit, and then it kind of sticks together, so it doesn't fray. Of course, if you do it a little longer, it'll just get really black. You just want to be mindful of that.
So I was a little curious, in the materials list, you did recommend acrylic yarn for the project and not necessarily like wool. Is there a specific reason for that?
I'm so happy you asked. Yes. So the reason I personally prefer acrylic is, or at least, you know, these specific types, is it typically doesn't have too much texture, right? So whereas this one, for example, granted it's a different type, and you might have like a combination of different yarns. So it could be a blend. It could be. I personally don't recommend cotton only, because if you try to burn the tip, it will burn, which I've had to learn. This one, it's primarily because you see this extra like fuzz here, because it's earrings and it's like near your your face and neck. It might like tickle. And also I find that acrylic is just kind of more put together in terms of that, like that texture. It's pretty minimal. I think that's why I recommended it. But by all means, if you want to experiment, or the other thing too, which I've done, is I've actually had 2 different types of yarns, and I put them together, and then I'll crochet them together. For example, this is one example. It's not quite finished, as you can see. I was trying to work off of like the holidays, holiday pattern. So there's actually 2, if you can see the red and the white here. I just kind of like held them together as if they were one, and then I crocheted back and forth, which we're gonna do right now. So we'll do that for this size, which is about, like, I want to say 2 inches diameter. I typically do, and here I'll show you an example of more so what we're gonna do. This is about 3 rows, which is I think pretty good. You will start noticing, depending on the tension as well as the size you're working with, which really, if you want, if for some of my sculptors out there, this is basically an armature, right? So we're just gonna start with a knot. So, and then one thing to keep in mind, so because you're gonna do a pair, right? And you see here that the opening here is in this direction. So it will be worn, right, in a certain way. Now, if you were to start your knot on the left for this earring, and you begin, there will be a side that has kind of a specific pattern, and the opposite side, it's similar, but you're gonna notice like subtle differences. And so for some of my folks, if you wanted to just be mindful of, if you like, we'll go ahead and start with the knot, right? So I'm just like making a loop and then tying it through the loop. Can y'all see that? And then just securing it. If you start over here for the next pair of earrings, I would recommend you start on the other side, right? Because of the way you wear your earrings. You want that kind of the exterior of it to be showing that same pattern as the other side, if that makes sense.
Yes, makes perfect sense.
Okay, yeah, so you just want to keep that in mind. And it's always a good practice to kind of just always leave a little extra. Doesn't hurt. At the end here. Now, there's 2 ways of approaching this, depending on how we're gonna move forward. We could either try to crochet this extra piece and just crochet over it, or we can just kind of let it be, and then at the end we can get the needle tool, kind of needle. Well, if it was a little longer, I apologize. Or the crochet hook, and then just kind of weave it back in so you don't see it. Does that make sense? And at the end, we'll leave a long enough piece, so we'll use this blunt needle and then just kind of crochet it back into itself, so you don't have any fraying or anything like that, or you don't even see where it begins or ends. All right, are we all ready? Hope you're excited. I'll go ahead and okay. There's a couple of things also to keep in mind for some of my beginners. Is there's 2 ways of holding the hook. So you can hold it, they call it, you could either hold it like a pencil, or you could hold it like a knife. For me, I like to hold it in this position, and then you will essentially be grabbing with this little hook the yarn and pulling it through a hole that you're making. I know, for example, my mother, she preferred this side, and then you would pull it upward. Same idea, it's a different gesture slightly. So you're either pulling up or you're just pulling across a little bit. All right, and then another thing to keep in mind is the tension, right? Now, aside from the fact that, that there's a knot there, there's a couple ways of holding the yarn on your left hand. Now, of course, I'm a right-hander, or that's my dominant hand, so that's what I'm going to show you with. I did include a link in the materials list, a video tutorial for those who are left-handed. So same technique, it's just, of course, it would be a different, different position, different rhythm. So what I like to do is I like to wrap it around my pinky, and then you kind of have a little better grip on it. And then what I do, I hold it right there. I'm gonna, do y'all see that? So this is how I'm holding it. I'm gonna go under the metal hoop earring and then just pull across here. And very similar to a basic chain stitch, right? You're just gonna do one, kind of wrap over one time over the hook. Can y'all see that? I'm gonna hold here with my thumb forefinger, just to add a little pressure, and then I'm just gonna, with the hook, go through the hoop. Okay, so I'll go ahead and repeat that. So I'm gonna wrap the yarn over, and then I'll go ahead and pull that little piece through the hoop. Okay. So, okay, I just realized the one thing, I just did a chain stitch right there. You wanna grab it from behind, right? Because you're wrapping, essentially you're wrapping around the chain stitch around our armature here. And then go over the hook and pull it through both loops. We'll do that again. Let me make sure it's at a good angle. There we go. So hook under, and then I'm wrapping the yarn over just the hook. So you see how there's one loop here, and then the one we just made. So you're gonna pull that through both. Which now you can kind of start seeing, we've already done 3 stitches, which, I have to say, they really look more like a braid to me than a chain, but we'll go ahead and use the terms as they are. We'll go ahead and do it again. So we're gonna go, here, let me go slowly for you. Here it is. I'm gonna go under and just get the yarn. I'm gonna wrap the yarn around, both around the earring and then just here around the hook. And then we'll pull that through both loops there.
Now, you had mentioned paying attention to tension as you're working. If you could describe the tension that you're using right now for this beginning sort of loop around it, how would you describe it?
Great question. So right now, it's actually, it's not tight. I'm kind of allowing the yarn to kind of go through my finger. I can show you an example of if it was more, if it was tighter, basically. It would be essentially, so same stitch, I would make, it would kind of, if it was tighter, it would just, the stitch itself would be smaller, of course, and then be closer to the hoop earring itself. And then you will notice that if you do change tension, right, as you're doing your, I guess, your first row of sorts, you'll see kind of it a little bit uneven. So I can show you an example of that. And also the other way you can kind of gauge the tension is if it's too tight, it's going to be really difficult for you to pull your hook through. If it's too loose, then it can actually be challenging as well. But you can see here, so if I make it a little looser, there are larger loops right? And it's and that I would say that's something you want to avoid, because otherwise it's going to move too much, and you kind of do want it to kind of stay somewhat in place. So again, if I were to make a really big hoop, or essentially like looser tension, you would see the difference between this, you know, these stitches, and then this one over here. It's like a little wider. And the nice thing, honestly, if you make a mistake, is I have to say it's pretty forgiving, right? You just go back, pull it, it'll undo itself. And then you just want to make sure that you find the loop, right? The main loop that you started with when you're working with. And also the other thing you want to be mindful of is sometimes, I've done this too, where accidentally my hook goes in between the threads, because there are multiple threads, of course, that make up the yarn. Now, if that happens, you're gonna you know, find out pretty quickly, because you're not gonna be able to move. You're not gonna be able to go to the next stitch. It's gonna be really challenging. And so, and on top of that, you see it kind of it begins to undo itself. So just kind of, as long as it doesn't get into a knot, then you'll be able to undo it pretty easily. Okay. The goal would be for, at least the purposes of this workshop, is we'll go around, and now some of you might want to consider, you know, exactly the shape you would like your earrings to be, in terms of, for example, do you want it to be like in this shape? I know that the other example we had was, I guess this is somewhat an example here too, just obviously it's more. You could do it like halfway, or you could do it more than that. For me, because I'm using this specific size, I believe I went between 25 to 30 stitches around. But ultimately you can kind of make that decision. Now, I will tell you that if your stitch is halfway, right? Or even like if you make it less, like if it's basically gonna be like almost like a keyhole shape, that you might, and then also of course, depending on if you really wanted to expand upon the length of it, so you basically add more rows, then it can naturally warp. And or it's because of the sheer nature of the fabric, it can, you know, change shape. So just be mindful of that too. So the reason why I decided on only 3 rows for this one is it doesn't really change shape much, or it doesn't move. And like you were saying, Gabby, earlier, it also is dependent on the tension. Yeah,
this is why I never mastered yarn crafts. I could never control the tension. I'm so terrible. I make like wonky scarves.
You know, I have to admit that it was only recently that I learned about that trick where you put it around your pinky finger, right? And then grab it. So it looks something like this. Before I used to hold it, and what starts happening is for me at least, is that I started feeling kind of this, I don't know, my own level of tension, because I was trying so hard to like hold the yarn a certain way. And after a while, if you're crocheting larger pieces, of course, like if you're crocheting for an hour, it starts to kind of cramped up on me. So going back to this, I'll go ahead and put my hook through and show it again. Let me make sure y'all can see. Go a little closer. So I'm going to grab it from behind. So you see how there's 2 loops there? And I'm going to wrap it over, make the 3rd loop, and then that one's gonna pull through. Okay. Under.
This is just a time reminder. We're about halfway through the workshop, Nathalie.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. For some of my crocheters who have a little bit more experience, you might, you know, kind of, I've even seen people that don't even look while they're doing their stitches. And you can continue. Now, I realized that I did not count my stitches, right? Because I just was like, I just kept going. Some of us might be very particular about you want your earrings to be the same shape. So I would advise you to, you can either eyeball it, you can either count your stitches, right, one at a time. Or if you just wanted to kind of go with the flow for your second earring in order to make the pair, you know, you can kind of gauge it in terms of like exactly how many stitches that was. And then the next time, if you do it again, I would just recommend just counting your stitches and making a little note for yourself. And then make sure that for the second earring, that you have the same number of stitches. So like I said, for this, I think I did do originally about 25 to 30 stitches. And I have to say, I would not recommend going all the way from kind of where the seam starts, right? Or that this facet starts all the way to the end, primarily because you're gonna have, you just have to keep in mind that there's gonna be the, you know, you're gonna add more rows. And it can obviously get caught in the end here, depending on which, what kind of hook you have. That's earring hook, that is. And or it, yeah, it could get it could possibly even just go over the facet here and get a little caught or even accidentally break or something like that. So that's also why in part why I make the shapes I do. I'll go ahead and do maybe a couple more, and then what we can do is I was just going fast just so you can see, look, I have one row, and then for the second row we're going to add, for this one you're just going to do an extra loop, right? And then you're going to turn it over because now we're going to go the opposite direction. And then you're going to go one up and then you're going to look the other way. So for this, you will see that there are these little holes here. Super convenient because you're going to now use that instead of the metal hoop earring. So you're going to go through that first little hole, pull the yarn, wrap over once, and then just like you did before, you're going to pull that through both those loops, I'm sorry. And again, you'll go through that next hole there. So now you have 2 loops around your hook. You're going to make the third and then you'll go through both of those. Again, through that hole, 2 loops around your hook. You're going to wrap one over and then pull through. Through, over, through. Okay, I'll do that again slowly. So you're going to go through the next hole, pull the yarn through, and now you're going to wrap over. So now you see 3, 1, 2, 3, and then you'll just pull that through. Now I just realized that I'm using my own little trick there. Okay.
You mentioned your own little trick.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't have it around my pinky. So I kind of just was holding it like this, which again, you're applying a certain amount of pressure, and after a while it can kind of give you you have to do a little finger exercises, so just cramp up. So I'll go ahead and continue. But of course you can take, at your own pace, you can go ahead and continue for the next row. Now I have to say this is rather therapeutic. If you really get the hang of it and you do it long enough, or if you end up doing like the same stitch for whatever pattern you're working with, because you have to really, that's the one thing too, you have to really focus, right? You can't really multitask.
It's also very soothing to watch.
Oh, that's good to hear. Sometimes I do pull like extra yarn just to make it a little convenient for you. Does anybody need me to repeat any of the steps? I'm happy to do it again slowly. I'm almost done with the second row, so I can show you the third one right now. So that one was a little tighter there, so it was a little difficult for me to put it through. So it's a good example of the tension.
So do you find that you plan your designs ahead of time? Like you have something in mind and then you ensure that, you build it that way? Or is it like you just start going and, let yourself be inspired by anything in particular?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting because I still consider myself quite an amateur, or a beginner, that it allows me to experiment more. So sometimes I intentionally decide on just seeing what happens, or I try something different, and ultimately if it doesn't work out or I don't like it, I could just undo it. I think that's the convenience about crocheting or even creating, right, to a certain extent. Now, I did mention that I have affinity for certain type of design. And also personally, I love bright, bold colors. I know this one might not show it right now. I do like a certain color. So sometimes I'll base it off the yarn I select based on the color and the texture. And now I know the examples I did show you prior didn't show too much of me using multiple colors, but sometimes I'll like add. So let me just quickly show you. So when I was starting to do kind of these like what I called heart shield necklaces, I started kind of also seeing, like combining certain colors together. And for me, always starting with that circle and working outwards, right? So this one would take me about an hour and a half to do, whereas, the earrings are a little bit shorter amount of time because it's just less work. And
I'm looking at your jewelry and your earrings and all your projects with the circle. And you had mentioned you were inspired by the Golden Kingdoms exhibition. And I know that we both chatted about this earlier, that we're both of South American descent as well. But I can't help but seeing the Francisco de Cislo sculpture that we have in our garden whenever I look at your artwork, sort of that like disc sitting there. It's really amazing.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I do also want to apologize. I realize that I'm accidentally shaking the phone, which is the second camera angle here. But yeah, it's very interesting because last year I started doing more research specifically in like the Inca Empire, and it's quite fascinating, of course, learning about. For me, those are my ancestors, and specifically their form of record keeping was quite literally with string and knots. And so it was this epiphany for me at one point where I was like, oh my goodness, crocheting is basically a series of knots, right? And similar to this very sophisticated record keeping system of these, knots that were found in, different parts of South America that yeah, I think it kind of, for me, like pun intended, came full circle. Okay, now you can stop here if you want. If you're like, you know what, I kind of want something a little simple. um, you're welcome to do that. You're also welcome to add, truthfully, as many more rows as you'd like. As I mentioned for the examples I showed you earlier, yes, the keepers. Yeah, which if you all don't know about them, I'd highly recommend you look into it, especially because there's new findings that just came out in the past couple of years about quipus, which is quite fascinating. Now, like as I mentioned before, this one has 3 rows. This one right now has 2. You kind of, decide how you'd like to move forward. I'll go ahead and maybe just stick to 2, so I can show you how I end it. Does that sound good? Okay, great. Move that aside for now. Now, okay, let me make sure you can see. I added the extra here just to show you again. So I'm at the end. Here's my hook. I just add 1 extra stitch there because I'm going to go up and around again for the final. Turn it over. And what I do, but of course, by all means, you're welcome to, decide on which stitch you'd like to end your project with, even if that's a knot. What I do is what's called a slip stitch. And truthfully, it's actually a simpler version of the stitch I just showed you. So just like we did before, I'm going to go through this next hole here, pull the yarn through. Now, instead of actually going over again, I actually just pull it through all the way. So it's actually much simpler. It kind of, for me, it's a nice, it actually adds a nice additional, what looks like a braid around. And so here, let me do that again. So you're going to go through the next hole here. So what I typically do is pull it over the hook. So this is from the back. Pull it, and then I'm just going to pull it right through that last loop. Do it again. And then as you can see, this is that braid that we're seeing again. And the braid is now on both sides. Whereas before it was just on one side. And the other thing too, the other reason I do this slip stitch to end it is because it adds like another, kind of another layer, if you will, of yarn. So it makes it a little thicker at the end. So it stays a little, stays in place. So I'll do that again, go through the hole over, and then I'm just gonna go right through the hole, wrap the yarn over, and go right through. Hole over, through. Over. and through. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and continue a little bit of a faster pace. Actually, this is a good example of, you might be able to see it. So I accidentally didn't, I went through the different threads that make the yarn. And if I were to continue, as you can see here, it would actually, it could cause a knot, or it can kind of stop me in my tracks a little bit. So good thing I caught that now, because what I'll do is I'll undo it and then make sure that I'm not in between the threads. Now, I may have mentioned this before, so the loop you start with, right? You want it to be kind of snug, not too tight, not too, definitely not loose, because it'll make it difficult to get the hook to do what you want it to do. But as long as it could move, you're in good shape. And I'll go ahead and continue. So this one's a slip knot through the hole, wrap around once, and then just go straight through that loop.
And I've placed Nathalie's Instagram, her art Instagram account, into the chat as well, if you're interested in learning more about her art practice and the objects that she makes.
Thank you. Okay. So it looks like we're getting close to being done. Now, the one other thing is you're going to notice here, looks like we're almost done, right? We got the last hoop in. And truthfully, I had to learn this over the years, is there's actually one more stitch right there. It's a little hard to see, and I apologize, because it's actually like, it's pretty snug, but it's right here. You'll be able to decipher that there's one last one. And now you're gonna see how it looks more, it's like even to the other side. So that would ultimately, actually almost my last stitch. So I'm gonna do just one over and through. And lastly, I'll show you how to weave it back into itself, so you don't see the end. Let me just get my, and like I said, be generous with the extra. And then what I do is actually just pull it through. See that? Okay.
I like how the sheen of the acrylic yarn gives it like this sort of like jewel-like quality, particularly with that specific color. It's like so shiny and attractive.
So good point, because you're going to notice, remember, the yarn types, they vary widely. And so this specific brand, or like this specific, not only brand, but type, this one's simply soft. And so it's intended to have, it kind of has almost like a, looks like a semi-glass, if you will. And making it somewhat like, not quite pearlescent, but it definitely has that sheen you're talking about. Whereas I know, for example, with some of the other ones I've worked with, they're more matte, if you will. They're pretty like not necessarily flat color, but they don't have a shine to them. So if that's something that you're interested in, or if you want to kind of work with. Okay, great. So we're almost done. Yay.
Does anybody have any questions, or does anyone need any extra tips, or would anyone like to share what they've been making? I unfortunately have not been making anything. I've been kind of monitoring the chat and keeping an eye on time, but if you've created anything and you're willing to share, we would love to see what you've made.
Yeah. Yes, we would definitely love, or if you want to take a picture and share with us afterwards too, or add it to the chat, you're welcome to do that. Okay, great. So I'm gonna go ahead and just finalize this earring. I'm gonna show you how you weave it back in. Now, because this one was a little shorter, which is maybe a good example of if it's too short, right? Your leftover yarn here versus long. You can get either a smaller hook if you have one, or the same hook. I'm gonna use one that's a little smaller. So this one's a 2.75 millimeter. And what you're gonna do is you're just gonna, remember those like holes you kind of naturally see, or grooves here? You're gonna put your hook, go ahead and put it through, excuse me. Let me put it this way. So you're gonna put it through, and then you're gonna grab this and just, kind of like we were doing before, pull it through. And then naturally you'll find the next hole. See that? Okay. Put your hook through, and then kind of just like pull it through. I'm gonna turn this over because you're gonna see basically it's kind of like sewing, like a basic sewing stitch. You're pulling it over under. So next one, I'm gonna just pull it through. Over under, over under. And then what's really nice is if you have a longer, just finish this side up. If you have, and we could always trim it too if we need to. If you have it a longer piece of yarn, then you can use your needle here. Just please keep in mind, you really want to make sure it's a blunt tip, so it should not be sharp. If you do have one sharp, you just have to, be mindful that you might puncture through the different threads in the yarn. And then, yeah, I think that's the main difference. Otherwise, this one, there's a little trick I recently learned. If you kind of hold it and kind of press it, and it's supposed to, let's see if it works. It's easier to get through. Ultimately, kind of like sewing, putting a thread, threading your needle. You're going to go ahead and do one and the same. You're just going to find naturally the nearest hole here. These holes, or like more or less like under each one of the last stitch you did. Right, so this braid here, you're just going to go under, go through, and pull through. Turn it over to see. So it's, again, it's like sewing it back into itself, the last row that you did, using those, you're gonna see like there's like little holes or gaps between each stitch. Over. Now, if you really wanted to make sure that this did not undo itself, then you can go maybe a longer ways. Sometimes I even go all the way, all the way around. And there we go. And if you just prefer to end it here, you can also just go right back to add a little sense of security there so it won't undo itself. Now, of course, you can add a knot or even double knot it at the end. Now, the one thing to be mindful of is because you have, for this size, right, and shape, the knot can be noticeable. And so it's really up to you how you'd like to end it. You can end it with the knot, and then just, like I said, I personally just use the lighter to burn the tips a little bit so they fuse together instead of fraying. This is a pretty common practice in terms of just having a little spare yarn to sew back into itself so you don't have that strip bump. Then when I'm gonna go ahead and say that it's good. If you really wanted to, you can go ahead and add a knot, right? Just create a loop, pull it through. Especially if it's at the end edge, or if you've determined which is the back side of your earring. Use my other, and you want to get it pretty close. And then again, I'll just burn the tips. And if you want, so you see here, you kind of see it protruding. You can pull it a little bit more and then kind of just do exactly what we did before. Pull it through. And you'll eventually have it kind of more inside. So you don't see it too much. But yeah, there you have it.
I like that, and I like the angling in of the ends. I don't know. I like the way that effect that it gives us. So we're at 7 p.m. and we want to be respectful of everybody's time as they head into this hopefully long weekend for everyone. Nathalie, can you tell us a little bit about, maybe, I know you're a full-time art worker right now, you're like constantly working on different projects, educator. Can you tell us a little bit about like what's coming up for you next as an artist, maybe a project that you're tackling or a new process? Oh, can you unmute your laptop?
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. In terms of my jewelry, I am working on some new pairs, like I showed you. And I know I showed you some examples of, like, you know, some necklaces and even experimenting more with the purses. So that's in terms of my crochet work. I also oversee a book club. So that's also something that I'm looking forward to working on this year in hosting book club meetings.
Would you mind posting a link maybe to your book club into the chat if people are interested?
Oh, yes.
So that they can check it out and perhaps join? I know I follow your book club on Instagram, so I always like seeing all your posts.
Thank you. I will most definitely add it.
Oh, sorry. And then if you are interested in additional MOLA programming, I am putting a link in there for our free Sunday tour. We have relaunched all of our Sunday tour projects. We're doing it monthly instead of weekly now because it's a little different sitting in front of your computer as opposed to stepping inside of galleries. But our docent, Paula Matusa, will be leading a tour of our exhibition, Oaxaca, California, through the experience of the duo Tlacolulocos. And Nathalie has just dropped the handle for her book club, and then also a form that you can check out if you're interested. And one last opportunity. Oh, and her Venmo, if you'd like to drop her a tip, please feel free to do so. It's in there. It's her first name and her last name. And if you'd like to share, we'll keep it open for a couple more minutes. If you'd like to show us what you're doing, I think we will go ahead and stop the YouTube stream now and take a couple of minutes if you're a little more comfortable with that and showing us what you've made.